In the tense decades of the Cold War, the most dangerous battles were not always fought with bombs, missiles, or fighter jets. Sometimes the greatest victories happened quietly, in hidden rooms filled with analysts, intelligence officers, and diplomats working to prevent a disaster that the world might never even know had almost happened. During those years, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed nuclear arsenals powerful enough to destroy civilization many times over. A single misunderstanding, a radar error, a misinterpreted military exercise, or a false intelligence report could trigger decisions that might spiral into nuclear war. That terrifying possibility forced both superpowers to rely on something just as important as military strength: intelligence. Because in the Cold War, knowing the truth about what your adversary was doing could mean the difference between catastrophe and survival. Stay with this story until the end, because what American intelligence officers uncovered during one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War may have prevented a nuclear miscalculation that could have changed history forever. Behind the scenes, the Central Intelligence Agency and other U.S. intelligence organizations were constantly studying Soviet military activity. Satellites watched missile bases from orbit, analysts monitored radar signals and communications, and field agents quietly gathered information about Soviet capabilities and intentions. Their mission was simple but incredibly important: understand what the Soviet Union was doing before political leaders were forced to make life-or-death decisions. To understand why this work mattered so much, we need to remember just how fragile the balance of the Cold War really was. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union developed massive nuclear arsenals capable of reaching each other's territory in minutes. Strategic bombers stood ready on runways, intercontinental ballistic missiles waited inside underground silos, and nuclear submarines patrolled the oceans carrying weapons powerful enough to destroy entire cities. The doctrine that governed this terrifying balance became known as mutually assured destruction, often shortened to MAD. The concept was grim but effective. If either superpower launched a nuclear attack, the other would still possess enough surviving weapons to respond with devastating retaliation. In theory, this meant that starting a nuclear war would guarantee the destruction of both sides. Because of this, the stability of the Cold War depended heavily on accurate information. Leaders on both sides had to know whether an attack was real or whether it was a misunderstanding. Radar systems monitored incoming missiles, intelligence agencies analyzed military movements, and diplomats tried to interpret the intentions of their adversaries. But the danger was always present. Several times during the Cold War, events came dangerously close to being misinterpreted as the start of a nuclear attack. False alarms from radar systems, unexpected military exercises, and confusing intelligence reports created moments where leaders had only minutes to decide how to respond. In those moments, intelligent analysis became absolutely critical. One such moment occurred during a period of particularly high tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Military activity was increasing. Exercises were being conducted on both sides, and communication between the two superpowers had become strained. Under these conditions, even routine military movements could appear threatening if they were misunderstood. Inside CIA headquarters and other intelligence agencies, analysts were carefully studying Soviet behavior. They examined satellite photographs of missile bases, tracked the movement of Soviet aircraft and submarines, and analyzed signals intercepted from military communications. Each piece of information helped build a larger picture of what Soviet forces were actually doing. What the analysts discovered was something extremely important. Certain Soviet military activities that might have appeared aggressive on the surface were actually part of routine defensive preparations. Troop movements that could be mistaken for offensive operations were often defensive deployments intended to protect against a possible American strike. Missile units that appeared to be preparing for launch were sometimes conducting maintenance or training exercises. Without careful intelligence analysis, these actions could easily have been misinterpreted. And during the Cold War, misinterpretation could be deadly. American intelligence officers understood that their work was not only about gathering information, it was about preventing mistakes. If political leaders believed that the Soviet Union was preparing for a nuclear attack, when it was not, they might feel pressure to launch their own weapons before it was too late. In other words, a misunderstanding could trigger the very war that both sides were trying to avoid. This is why intelligence agencies devoted enormous effort to understanding the intentions behind Soviet military activities, not just the activities themselves. Satellite images were compared with historical data. Analysts studied patterns of behavior in Soviet exercises. Communication signals were analyzed for subtle clues about military readiness. Every detail mattered. Sometimes the difference between peace and catastrophe could depend on whether analysts correctly interpreted a single piece of information. In one critical situation, the intelligence gathered by American analysts helped clarify what was actually happening behind the Iron Curtain. Instead of interpreting Soviet military movements as preparations for a surprise attack, intelligence agencies determined that the activity was defensive in nature. This assessment allowed American leaders to avoid escalating the situation unnecessarily. It was a quiet success, the kind that rarely appeared in headlines. But during the Cold War, quiet successes were often the most important ones, because preventing a nuclear war did not require winning a battle. Sometimes it required understanding the enemy well enough to know when a battle was not actually coming. And in the complex, dangerous world of Cold War intelligence, that understanding often came from the careful work of analysts who spent their days studying satellite images, intercepted signals, and fragments of information that revealed what was really happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain. But the story does not end there, because the operation that helped prevent this dangerous misunderstanding involved far more than analysts sitting behind desks. It involved secret intelligence networks, advanced surveillance technology, and a series of discoveries that revealed just how close the world sometimes came to making a catastrophic mistake. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Cold War had entered one of its most dangerous phases. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union had deteriorated sharply. Diplomatic trust was low, military budgets were expanding on both sides, and new generations of nuclear weapons were being deployed across Europe and Asia. Each superpower believed the other might be preparing for an advantage in the global balance of power. In such an environment, even small misunderstandings could become extremely dangerous. Military planners in both Washington and Moscow were forced to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Radar networks were upgraded to detect incoming missiles faster than ever before. Nuclear submarines patrolled the oceans constantly. Strategic bombers remained ready to take off at a moment's notice. And underground missile silos stood on alert across vast territories. But the most dangerous element of this system was the speed at which decisions might have to be made. If early warning systems detected a possible nuclear launch, political leaders might have only minutes to determine whether the threat was real. In those moments, they would rely heavily on intelligence assessments, the analysis provided by experts who studied enemy capabilities and intentions. Inside the Central Intelligence Agency and other American intelligence organizations, analysts were deeply aware of how fragile the situation had become. One of the biggest concerns involved Soviet fears of a surprise nuclear attack from the United States. During this period, Soviet leadership had grown increasingly suspicious of American military exercises and technological developments. Some officials inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus even believed that the United States might attempt a sudden strike designed to destroy Soviet nuclear forces before they could respond. To Western observers, this fear might have seemed exaggerated. But inside the Soviet Union, memories of World War II, when Nazi Germany had launched a devastating surprise invasion, still shaped strategic thinking. Soviet leaders believed that vigilance against surprise attacks was essential to national survival. This fear led Soviet intelligence services to launch a secret monitoring effort known as Operation Ryan. The objective of Operation Ryan was to detect any signs that the United States might be preparing a nuclear first strike. Soviet intelligence agents around the world were instructed to watch for unusual activity that might indicate an impending attack. They monitored military bases, communication patterns, and political developments. Even seemingly small signals, increased activity at NATO headquarters, unusual movement of aircraft, or heightened security around government buildings could be interpreted as warning signs. From the Soviet perspective, this operation was defensive, but from the perspective of American intelligence analysts, it introduced a new risk. If Soviet leaders were actively searching for signs of an American attack, they might misinterpret ordinary military activities as evidence that a strike was about to occur. In other words, their attempt to prevent surprise could actually increase the risk of misunderstanding. American intelligence agencies gradually became aware of Operation Ryan through various sources, including intercepted communications and intelligence gathered from human sources. When analysts began piecing together the information, they realized something deeply concerning. The Soviet leadership appeared to be far more worried about a surprise attack than American officials had previously believed. This meant that routine NATO military exercises, which had been conducted for years without major incidents, might suddenly appear threatening to Soviet observers. One particular exercise would soon highlight just how dangerous this misunderstanding could become. In November 1983, NATO launched a command post exercise known as Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to simulate the procedures that NATO forces would follow in the event of a nuclear conflict. It included communications between military commands, simulated alerts for nuclear forces, and coordination between different NATO countries. For NATO planners, the exercise was routine. Similar exercises had been conducted before, and they were considered essential for maintaining readiness in case of a real crisis. But what NATO leaders did not fully realize was how the exercise might appear from Moscow. Because Soviet intelligence services, operating under the assumptions of Operation Ryan, were carefully watching for exactly this type of activity. As Able Archer progressed, Soviet analysts began observing several developments that matched the warning indicators they had been instructed to monitor. NATO communications increased. Military command structures became more active. Simulated alerts involving nuclear forces appeared in communication channels. From the Soviet perspective, these signals could potentially resemble preparations for a real attack. Inside Soviet military circles, concern began to grow. Some intelligence reports suggested that Soviet forces in Eastern Europe increased their readiness levels during the exercise. Certain units reportedly prepared for the possibility that NATO might be disguising a real nuclear strike as a training operation. The situation had the potential to become extremely dangerous. If Soviet leaders had concluded that a surprise attack was underway, they might have considered launching their own nuclear forces before NATO's hypothetical strike could occur. Fortunately, American intelligence analysts were paying close attention to the situation. Through their monitoring of Soviet communications and military movements, they detected signs that the Soviet Union was reacting to the exercise more seriously than expected. Analysts realized that what NATO considered routine training might actually be interpreted in Moscow as a possible preparation for nuclear war. This realization became critically important because once American officials understood how the exercise was being perceived, they were able to ensure that it ended without further escalation. The exercise concluded, and tensions gradually eased. In the aftermath, intelligence agencies carefully reviewed the events surrounding Able Archer 83. Their analysis suggested that the world might have come closer to nuclear misunderstanding than many people realized at the time. What had prevented the situation from escalating further was not military strength, or weapon systems, or political speeches. It was intelligence, the ability of analysts to interpret signals, understand the fears of the other side, and recognize when a misunderstanding might be developing helped prevent a situation that could have spiraled out of control. And in the quiet world of Cold War intelligence, that kind of success was often invisible, but enormously important. Because sometimes the greatest victory is the war that never happens. As the NATO exercise Able Archer 83 continued in November 1983, something unusual was unfolding on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Inside the Soviet Union, intelligence officers and military commanders were closely watching NATO's activity with growing concern. The Cold War had already been tense for years, but the early 1980s had pushed that tension even higher. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the deployment of new American missiles in Europe, and increasingly hostile political rhetoric between Washington and Moscow had created an atmosphere of deep mistrust. In such an environment, military signals were often interpreted through the lens of fear. When Soviet intelligence agencies observed NATO's command exercise escalating through simulated stages of nuclear readiness, some analysts inside the Soviet system began to worry that this might not be an exercise at all. Under Operation Ryan, Soviet intelligence officers had been instructed to search for signs that a surprise nuclear attack might be approaching. The problem was that many of the indicators they were monitoring could also appear during routine military training. The difference between training and real preparation was not always obvious. As NATO forces conducted their simulated nuclear procedures, Soviet intelligence reports began reaching higher levels of the Soviet command structure. Some of those reports suggested that the exercise might be a cover for actual preparations. According to later intelligence assessments, Soviet military units in Eastern Europe began increasing their alert status. Air forces stationed in Soviet-controlled territories reportedly prepared aircraft that were capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Missile forces were placed on heightened readiness. Commanders began watching NATO movements more carefully than ever. From Moscow's perspective, caution seemed necessary. If the United States and its allies were actually preparing for a surprise attack, failing to respond quickly could be catastrophic. Nuclear strategy during the Cold War often revolved around the concept of launch on warning, the idea that if incoming missiles were detected, retaliation might have to occur immediately before those missiles destroyed key military assets. This doctrine created a dangerous reality. Leaders might have only minutes to interpret the situation before making decisions with global consequences. Fortunately, American intelligence agencies were closely monitoring Soviet reactions. Through a combination of signals intelligence, satellite surveillance, and human sources, analysts began noticing subtle signs that Soviet forces were behaving differently during the exercise. These indicators suggested that Soviet commanders were not treating Able Archer as just another NATO training event. Instead, they were responding with real concern. This realization reached intelligence officials in Washington. Inside the CIA and other agencies, analysts began discussing the possibility that Soviet leaders might genuinely fear that NATO was preparing for a nuclear strike. The implications were deeply troubling. If Soviet commanders believed that an attack was imminent, they might take actions that could escalate the situation rapidly. At that moment, intelligence became the most powerful tool available. Understanding the enemy's perception was just as important as understanding the enemy's weapons. American intelligence officers recognized that the Soviet leadership was operating under a set of assumptions shaped by Operation Ryan and by years of political tension. From their point of view, NATO's exercise could resemble the early stages of a real attack. Fortunately, the exercise itself had a defined schedule. Able Archer was designed to simulate escalating levels of nuclear readiness, but would eventually conclude without any real military action. As the exercise approached its final stages, NATO forces began returning to normal operations. For Soviet observers, this gradual return to normal activity provided reassurance that the feared attack was not actually taking place. The crisis slowly passed, but the lessons from the event were profound. When American intelligence analysts reviewed the situation afterward, they concluded that the exercise had come dangerously close to triggering a serious misunderstanding between the two superpowers. The Soviet leadership had interpreted routine military activity through the lens of extreme suspicion, and without careful monitoring, the situation might have escalated much further. In the world of nuclear strategy, perception could be just as dangerous as reality. This realization changed how intelligence agencies and military planners approached similar situations in the future. Greater attention was given to understanding how actions might appear from the perspective of the other side. Communication channels between Washington and Moscow became even more important in preventing accidental escalation. In many ways, the events surrounding Able Archer revealed something essential about the Cold War. Both superpowers possess enormous military power, but they were also constantly trying to avoid a catastrophic conflict that neither side truly wanted. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies played a critical role in maintaining that fragile balance. They monitored military activity, interpreted signals, and warned political leaders when misunderstandings might occur. Their work was rarely visible to public, but often made the difference between calm decision-making and dangerous panic. The episode demonstrated that intelligence was not only about gathering secrets. Sometimes it was about preventing disasters. And in the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, where nuclear weapons stood ready on both sides, the ability to recognize a misunderstanding could be one of the most important contributions intelligence officers could make to global security. Yet even today, many historians believe the world did not fully understand just how close that moment may have come to disaster. Because when the full details of Able Archer 83 were finally revealed years later, the story showed something remarkable. A training exercise, routine by NATO standards, had briefly become one of the most dangerous misunderstandings of the Cold War. In the years after Able Archer 83, intelligence officials on both sides of the Cold War began to understand something deeply important. The greatest danger in a nuclear standoff was not always a deliberate attack. Sometimes the real threat was misunderstanding. The Cold War had created an environment where both the United States and the Soviet Union expected the worst from each other. Military exercises, troop movements, or even changes in communication patterns could suddenly appear suspicious if viewed through the lens of fear and distrust. When nuclear weapons were involved, that kind of misinterpretation could become incredibly dangerous. What the events surrounding Able Archer demonstrated was that perception mattered just as much as capability. The United States had not been preparing for a nuclear strike. NATO forces were conducting a routine command exercise designed to practice procedures in case of a crisis. But because Soviet leaders had already been conditioned by Operation Ryan to watch for signs of an American first strike, the exercise looked very different from their perspective. For a brief moment, the two superpowers were looking at the same events through completely different assumptions. That difference in interpretation was exactly the kind of situation intelligence agencies were meant to detect. In the months and years that followed, American intelligence organizations studied the episode carefully. Analysts reviewed intercepted communications, satellite imagery, and reports from various intelligence sources to understand how the Soviet leadership had interpreted NATO's actions. The conclusion was clear. The Soviet Union had taken the exercise far more seriously than anyone in the West had realized at the time. Some Soviet units had raised their readiness levels. Certain aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons had been prepared for potential deployment. Missile forces had become more alert. While historians still debate exactly how close the situation came to a real crisis, the evidence suggested that Soviet leaders were genuinely concerned that a surprise attack might be underway. That realization deeply influenced how American policymakers thought about the Cold War moving forward. The lesson was not that military exercises were dangerous by themselves. Training and readiness remained essential for national defense. But leaders began recognizing that communication and transparency could play a critical role in preventing misunderstandings. Gradually, new efforts were made to improve communication between the two superpowers. The hotline between Washington and Moscow, originally established after the Cuban Missile Crisis, became an even more important tool for preventing accidental escalation. Arms control agreements included provisions that required advance notification of certain large military exercises. Both sides began sharing limited information about strategic weapons deployments, helping reduce the risk that routine activities might appear threatening. These steps did not end the Cold War overnight, but they helped stabilize one of the most dangerous rivalries in human history. And behind many of those decisions was a quiet influence of intelligence analysis, the work of analysts who had recognized how close misunderstanding could bring the world to disaster. The story of Able Archer 83 is not as dramatic as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it did not involve public confrontations between world leaders. For many years, the full details of the episode remained classified, known only to a small group of intelligence officials and policymakers. Yet the lessons from that moment were profound. It showed that the Cold War was not only a contest of weapons and military strength. It was also a contest of information, interpretation, and judgment. The ability to understand the intentions of an adversary could be just as important as the ability to defeat them in battle. In this case, intelligence analysis helped prevent a dangerous miscalculation, one that might have escalated into something far worse. Because in a world filled with nuclear weapons, avoiding war was sometimes the greatest victory of all. And the analysts, officers, and intelligent professionals who worked behind the scenes during those tense decades rarely appeared in headlines or history books. But their work helped ensure that the Cold War remained exactly that, cold,